All right, Rabbi, say good morning. Good morning. Eschus Baruch Hashem to begin another week of Daf Yomi together. Let us begin by thanking our sponsors, thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, to thank Yanki and Elisa Statman and Yitzi and Rebecca Statman for dedicating the Shiurim this month in commemoration of the first yard site of their sister Menucha Shendel Yehudis Zichron Levracha Bas David Yosef, and to thank Shmuel and Rabbi Karabkin for dedicating the Shiurim this month in commemoration of the 25th yard site of Rabin's mother, Melanie Salman Pesa Mira Bas Chaim Zichron Levracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama Salav and Aliyah and the families a Nechama. And to thank Mr. and Mrs. Eric Schaefer from all the way from Texas for going ahead and dedicating today's pastries, today's mazonos. And a thank you to them. I will say with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. So the truth is, and if we have time at the end, I'd like to also get in today's Mesilas Yesharim. As you know, again, that we're following, again, remember on the Hachzik program. So the Hachzik program stops for no one, including on Sundays. So, Baruch Hashem, we have it's a short piece today, so hopefully we'll be able to get in towards the end of this year. All right, so today's Daf is Chavav 26. If it's okay, we're actually just going to back up a little bit, just to the two dots on Chav base, on Chav Ham and base, 25b. We'll read it through quickly, just because it gives us the good orientation for the sugya. So remember again, the Gemara quotes the two dots. So we are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 lines up from the bottom. We're going to see actually today's daf goes quickly. We're actually going to try to make it Emir Hashem to the Mishnah on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. That's right. You heard it. I'm throwing down the gauntlet over here, right? That Bli Neder, right? By the way, you know what that's called in halacha? That's called Nidrei Zerazin. So let's begin. So the Mishnah said as follows. The Mishnah said, Ro Osan Ochlin. So we'll say, so if you remember again, the Mishnah spoke about a case where I walk into my field, I see a bunch of people eating my figs. And I say, Hari Alechem Karban. Obviously, I'm not happy with this, right? I'm not pleased with what I see. So I essentially go ahead and declare my figs like a karban to anyone who is consuming it. What's the problem? The problem is it turns out that my father or my brothers happen to be among that group. Now, obviously, I never had intention to prohibit my father or my brothers to anything in the field, but it just happens to be now they're part of the group. So both say, so what's the halacha? So Beis Shammai says, my father and my brothers are permitted, right? Hey mutarin, but the rest of the group is aser. And Beis Hillel says the entire group is mutter. So let's analyze this. Says the Gemara, Tanan poschin b'Shabbos yom tovim. So both say we actually spoke this out a little while ago. This is actually a fascinating case. We will see on Samech Vav Amud Aleph, where Rabbi say a person goes there not to eat, takes a neder not to eat meat or drink wine, and then what happens? He comes to the Chacham to have it annulled, and the Chacham said, had you realized that on Shabbos and Yom Tiv you wouldn't be able to drink meat or wine, or had you remembered about Shabbos and Yom Tiv, would you have made the neder? And of course, he says, no, of course not. That creates an effective Pesach for neder annulment. But Rishona Hayu Omrim, Shabbos says, here's what's interesting about that halacha. So now I know, in other words, what does it mean then when that neder is annulled? That it's annulled just for Shabbos and Yom Tiv, but it remains in effect for the rest of the days? Or that, no, it's annulled for everything? So, Barishona Hayu Omrim, Osan Hayamim Mutarim, Ushar Kol Yom Masurim. It used to be that they thought that again, it's Shabbos and Yom Tiv that's mutter, but all of the other days ultimately will remain aser. Ad Sheba Rabbi Akiva v'limed, until Rabbi Akiva came along and taught us a very important halacha, neder shehutar mitzaso, hutar kulo. Ultimately, again, a neder that is permitted in part becomes totally permitted. Or in other words, to say it a bit differently, once you go ahead and are matir and permit a part of a neder, by definition, the rest of the neder becomes permitted as well. Rabbi Akiva's model is a neder is an all or nothing proposition. And therefore, halacha l'maaseh, either you're in or you're out, which is an interesting, I will say, if you think about it like hashkafically, what Rabbi Akiva is saying is, what's a neder? A neder is a commitment to behave a certain way. Rabbi Akiva says, a commitment is effective if you're all in. And if you're not all in, then by definition, that's not a neder. In other words, there's no halfway point in terms of honoring one's life's commitments. Either you're in or you're not. Neder shoter miktsaso hoter kulo. Which I also mean for that case, that the moment that you're marking the neder for Shabbos and Yom Tiv, what happens to the rest of the neder? What happens to the rest of the neder? Totally void. Okay, so we'll say therefore the Gemara says as follows. Now we'll say, just to understand, why is this put in here? Why is this statement here? Because the Pashtos, what the Gemara is saying is like this. I walk into my field, I see people eating from my figs. I say, hey, Chavra, those figs are like a carbon to you. Then I say, hey, Dad, right? I see my father's there, my brothers are there. So what happens? Obviously, I never meant for the neder to devolve upon them. So the Pashtos, what we're saying is, just like the neder doesn't devolve upon them, therefore what? It doesn't devolve upon the rest of the group as well. Amar Rabbi. So Rabbi says, let's analyze this a little bit. The Kuli Alma, Kol Heichad the Amar Ilu Hayisi Odeh Sha'aba Beinechem Hayisi Omer. So let's listen to this. Rabbi says like this. In a case, and we're going to see the Shulchan Aruch, we'll say it's going to be, I just want to give you coming attractions for this daf. There's going to be a tremendous amount just of back and forth about the phraseology of the neder that we're talking about, that is in question. But what I just want to sensitize you to is the entire sugya rests on this statement of Rabbi Akiva. Namely, do we accept the premise of neder shehutar mikzaso hutar kulo or no? In other words, do we say that there's the possibility to annul a segment of the neder, but the rest of it remains intact? Or no? Once you go ahead and you annul a part, then what? The entire thing ultimately again falls apart. So Rabbi says like this: the Koli Alma, everyone agrees. Kol Heichad the Amar. If the vower says, I walk into my field and I say, Ilu Hayisi Odea Sha'aba Beinechem. I walk in and I say, you know what? Had I realized, in other words, I made the neder. Right? I was saying, I walk into my field, I see people eating my figs. My reaction, displeasure, right? And therefore I say, Konam those figs upon all of you. Then I realize my father and my brother are there. So Rabbi says, watch this. Rabbi says, if I would say, now after having realized my father and brothers are there, Elu Hayisi Odeh Sha'aba Beinechem, had I known that my father was there, Hayisi Umar, I would have said, Kulchem Asurim Chutz Me'aba. That would have been the phraseology of my answer. I would have said, guys, all of you are asur except my father. What would be the halacha? The kulon asurin va'aviv mutar. So Rabbi say, in that type of explicit exclusionary statement, everyone agrees that such a neder like that works, right? You could frame a neder like that says, guys, all of you are asur, my father is mutar. So what's the machlokes beisham beisilal? No mechlaku ella ba'omer ilu hayisi odeh sha'aba beinechem. Had I known that my father was with you, hayisi omer ploni uploni asurin va'aba mutar. Rabbi say, what's the machlokes case? The machlokes case is not when I phrase it as kulchem, but instead when I phrase it as ploni uploni. I would have said you, Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Yisachar, Zvulun, you're all asur. My father's mutar. Rabbi wants to suggest that's the machlokes case. That's the machlokes case between Meisham and Beisal. Rabbi say, what's the difference between the two cases? Difference between case one and case number two is talking about a collective. Right? The collective is asur, my father's mutar. Okay, so the neder devolves upon the collective. The second case is where you're framing the neder as what? Devolving upon individuals. So now you're saying this individual applies to, my father it doesn't apply to. Oh, so now what you're doing is you're pulling out an individual from a group of individuals. What does that do to the rest of the neder? So Beis Shammai says it works absolutely fine. Your father's mutar, everyone else is asur. Beis Hillel seems to say, no, at the end of the day, once you're pulling out one individual, i.e. your father, what happens to the rest of the neder? By definition, it falls apart. Why? It seems to be based on the statement of Rabbi Akiva that neder shehutar mikzaso hutar kulo. Once you know part of the neder, you're pulling out one individual, i.e. your father, therefore by definition the neder falls apart for the rest of the individuals as well. If you take a look at the Ran on the top of Chaf Vav, this is actually the Ran that goes on this. He says, Beishamai kirabanon, the leslu neder shuter mikzaso hutar kulo, or Beis Hillel Rabbi Akiva. So that's it. The Ran just says it clearly. Rabbi says, so in Rabba's model, if you say kulchem asurim chutz me'aba, everyone agrees that works. What's the machlokes case where you say ploni's asur, ploni's asur, ploni's asur, ploni's asur, my father's not asur? So now, what is that? So Beis Shammai says that halacha l'maisa, okay, you've excluded your father, and everyone else is Aser. Beis Hillel says, no, once your father becomes mutter, everyone else is mutter as well. What's at the core of their machlokes? Do you subscribe to the principle of Rabbi Akiva or not? Do you say neder, shuter, mitzasar, huter, kulo or not? Beis Hillel says yes. Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Akiva. Therefore, once you pull out the father from the list of individuals, the entire neder falls apart. And Beis Shammai says no. You could go ahead and exclude the father, but still have the neder binding on everyone else. That's Rabbah. Top of Chavav. Rava says the kuli amal kleicha amar ilu ayisi odeya sha'aba b'neichem. Rava says no. In the case, I will say again. So remember, the case always starts the same. I walk into the field. I see people eating my figs. I get upset. I say, "Konam my figs unto all of you." Now I discover my father's there. So now Rava says, when confronted with the reality of this neder, if I say, "Kolecha da amar ila yisi der shabanechem," how do you know that my father was here? Hayisi omer ploni uploni asurin va'aba mutter. So I will say now, according to Rava, if I would have said, "Ploni, you guys are aser, right? As individuals." But my father is mutter, so what's the halacha? Kulam mutarin. In that case, ultimately, again, Rava says, everyone remains mutter. Right? Everyone's mutter. Which Rava said means what? In other words, that once you're pulling out the father, by definition, the rest of the neder falls apart. Lo nechluku ela ba'omer, ilu hayis yodeh shal menechem. What's the machlokes case? The machlokes case is where I say, had I realized that my father is there, hayisi omer kulchem asurim chutz me'aba. So we'll say Rava is the exact opposite of Rabbah. Rava is the opposite of Rabbah. So Rava says the machlokes case is when you say kulchem asurim chutz me'aba. All of you are asur except my father. So we'll say, what would be the problem with that verbiage? What's the machlokes Beis Shammai? So this is fascinating. Beis Shammai savrila k'Rabbi Meir da'amar tafus lashon rishon. Ubeis Hillel savrila k'Rabbi Yossi da'amar bigmar devarav adam nitbas. They both say this is such a fascinating machlokes. When a person makes two statements that to a certain degree are at odds with each other, actually the Ran goes ahead, the Ran quotes that this case is actually a case in Maseches Temura, where the Ran writes, I both say, if you look at the first of the intermediate lines of the Ran says, Gabe harizet temuras ola, v'chazar v'amar harizet temuras shlomim. So I will say a person's making a temura, which we're not getting into details over here. The point is a person gives two opposite designations to an animal. One as a shlomim and one as an ola, one as a shlomim. So a person makes two contradictory statements. Which statement do you pay attention to? So Rabbi says, so this in and of itself is the subject of machlokes. So Rabbi Meir says, Tafas lashon rishon. When you're making two statements that seem to be at odds with each other, we look at the first statement. Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Yossi, who says, Bigmar devarav adam nitbas. No, a person ultimately, again, is held accountable for the last thing they say. Now, I will say, so let's play this out just a little bit. So according to Rava, the machlokes case is not ultimately, again, where you say, Ploni aser, chutz me'aba. Why? Because in that case, everyone agrees that since this is a neder that is comprised of individuals, once you pull out one individual, what happens? The entire neder falls apart. What's their machlokes case? It's fascinating. Their machlokes case is where I say, Kulchem aser, chutz me'aba. So I will say, so now, what's interesting about this neder is there's two components. There's the kulchem, so I've made a group neder, and then I've made an exclusion, pulling out an individual. So what do we look at, or what do we lend primacy to in this case? Do we look at the first part of the neder, in which case this is effectively a neder of kulchem, and therefore the neder should work? Or do we look at this as a chutz me'aba, pulling out an individual, in which case the neder should fall apart? So I both say, so that's the machlokes. Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Meir, that ultimately when a person makes inherently contradictory statements, we look at the first statement. Therefore, according to Beis Hillel, I will say, what is this? This is a neder of kulchem. This is a neder of kulchem. And a neder of kulchem works. Now again, I want to be clear, even Beis Shammai agrees I have the ability to exclude my father from this neder. But the exclusion of my father does not go ahead and undermine the effectiveness of the neder for everyone else. Because we lend primacy to the first statement of kulchem. Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Yossi, who says, Bigmar dvarav adam nitbas. What we lend primacy to is what? Is the last statement. What was the last statement? Chutz me'aba. which then makes it a neder of individuals. Once it's a neder of individuals and you pull out one individual, then what happens? The whole thing falls apart. So we'll say that's machlokes. Let's say, I'll tell you, I was looking at this last night a little bit. It's something so interesting in this, because we'll say, right, isn't life filled with so many contradictory statements? Right? Personal statements that we make. I don't even mean things that we say. Let's say, so often in life we make statements not verbally, but we make statements actionally. Right? I go ahead and I say so many things by how I behave. And what's the greatest challenge in life? Often I'm making contradictory statements. I act this way and then I act that way. I do this and I do that. And my life is filled with these contradictory statements. So what happens in life? What happens in life? I look in the mirror and I look at myself and I try to figure out, who am I? Who am I? I have all these contradictory statements. I'm saying I want to be a tzaddik, and then I act like a rasha. Right? I want to be a rasha, then I act like a tzaddik. So who am I? So we'll say, so this is the machlokes of Beis Shammai. Beis Shammai says, you want to know who you are? What you start with, what you lead with, that determines who you are. That determines who you are. And this is always Beis Shammai, right? Beis Shammai is like the midas hadin. So you acted like this, that's what you are. What does Beis Hillel say? Beis Hillel says, what do they say, like in the business world, you're only as good as your last deal? Is there a statement like that, or did I just make that up? If not, I would urge you to use it. I think it's good, right? I think it's
first out.
Right, first and right. You're only as good as your last deal. So we'll say. So Beis Hillel says that the truth is, who are you? Look at where you are right now. Tafas lashon acharon. Where are you right now? Wherever you are right now, that's who you are. Now again, if you're doing great stuff, fantastic. And if you're a rasha, problematic. But the good news is, according to Beis Hillel, the process of tshuva, the process of change, the ability to constantly redefine myself, that door is always open. Because tafas lashon acharon. We look at where you're holding right now, and that is the determinant of your spiritual, personalistic state. What a fantastic machlokes. Beis Shammai, tafas lashon rishon. What did you start with? How did you start out in life? Where did you start? That's such a determinant of what you are. Beis Hillel says, "Ay vavai." That's the determinant of why I'm in such trouble. Also, then how does tshuva fit in there? Tafas lashon acharon. You want to know where you're holding your life? What are you doing now? What are you doing now? That's what matters most. And if you're happy with what you're doing now, keep doing it. If you're unhappy with what you're doing now, change it. And ultimately, again, you can constantly evolve. Incredible. So Rav Papa raised the kasha to Rava. Keisad am Rabbi Akiva neder shuter mitzasa huter kula. So that's actually very interesting. So remember again, we were introduced. This is why I wanted to go back a little bit. We were introduced on Chafhem with base Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva introduced us to this concept of neder shuter mitzasa huter kula. That once one part of the neder becomes permitted, the entire neder becomes permitted. So what's the case where Rabbi Akiva said that? This is actually very interesting. Listen to this. He says, Sha'ini nene lekulchem. So we'll say, so what happens? So I'm sorry. So konam she'ini nene lekulchem. So we'll say a person makes a neder. Right? Konam, it should be asked to me as a carbon. I will not benefit from any of you. So I'm making a neder, not to benefit from kulchem, from a group of individuals. Hoter echad mehen. Once one of them becomes permitted, then what? Hotru kulam. All of them become permitted. So we'll say, what do you see? What is this a case of? This is very interesting. This is a case of kulchem. It's a case of kulchem. So lemais again, in a case of kulchem, Rabbi Akiva seems to say, once you permit one, by definition, the entire neder falls apart. On the flip side, lo lazeh ulazeh. I will say, but again, on the flip side, if I say I won't get benefit from this one, and from this one, and from this one, then hutter harishon, hutra kulam. So I will say, now we're being introduced to another kind of case. I will say, what is this interesting case? This is where I'm linking my Nedarim one to the next, to the next, to the next. I say, right, I will not get Hana from Ruvain, and from Shimon, and from Levi, and from Yehuda, and I'm linking a lezeh. So it's actually very interesting. Hutter harishon, hutra kulam. I will say, if I release the neder from Ruvain, right, I pull Ruvain out of the neder, then I will say, what happens? It creates a cascading effect, and everyone, so to speak, beneath Ruvain, because we view everyone as being a derivative of Ruvain, becomes mutter as well. Otra acharon, I will say, but let's say again, I went all the way through Yehuda, and now I permit Yehuda, then ultimately again, acharon mutar, the kulon asurin. Right? So therefore, Yehuda is going to be mutar, but everyone else ultimately again is still under the neder. So let's analyze this. So bishlam the Rabba, so according to Rabba's version, mukim la l'reisha, the amar lazeh ulazeh. So according to Rabba could set up our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah's case of the figs, as talking about a case of what? Of lazeh, ulazeh, ulazeh. Right? I go ahead and I walk in, in other words, I after being confronted with the fact that my father is in my field, and I just made an neder prohibiting everyone, I say, you know what? Had I known that my father was there, I would have said, this one's usher, this one's usher, this one's usher, my father's mutter. The Seifa, and then the Seifa is talking about a case, Kulchem. Ultimately, again, where I use Lashon of Kulchem, Ela L'didach, but according to Rava, Bishlam Reisha, Mokim La Da'amar Kulchem. So I understand the Reisha, i.e. the Mishnah, you can set that up as talking about a case of Kulchem, Amud Beis. Ela Seifa, Da'amar L'zeh U'L'zeh, Rabbi Akiva. But if he's going to set up the Seifa as talking about a case of L'zeh U'L'zeh, where he's linking them one to the other, does that still reflect the view of Rabbi Akiva? So the Gemara says, Amai pligi Rabbanan alein. So why would Rabbanan argue on that? Va'amrit divrei hakol mutter. Didn't we just establish before that Allah Chalamais in that kind of case, ulazeh, that everyone agrees that once you release one, what happens? Everyone else becomes permitted. Amrle Rava. So I'm saying, Amrle Rava, so Rava will respond. Ula Rabba, Rabbi Akiva minecha, and according to Rabba, does Rabbi Akiva's position make sense over here? Seifa b'may mokimla. How will you set up the Seifa? So again, so this is what I mentioned before. So now what we've done is we've created two models of Rabba and Rava. They're actually reverses of each. They're actually opposites of each other. In order to explain the machlokes, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. At play here is the fundamental principle of Rabbi Akiva of Neder Shutar Mitzasa Hutar Kulo. Now the Gemara just quoted the Brisa where Rabbi Akiva himself is actually mentioned. Based on all of this, now we're trying to figure out how Rabba and Rava would read both the Mishnah and the Brisa. Or I should say both the Reisha and the Seifa, excuse me. So Seifa b'may mokimla. How do we set up the Seifa? The Amar l'kulchem. So if that's the case, Hey din hu rishon, ve'hei din hu acharon. What's considered to be the first case, and what's considered to be the second case? Ella, Reisha da'amar l'kulchem. Rather, Rabbi said it has to be the Reisha, which we refer to as the Mishnah. The Reisha must be talking about a case of kulchem, where again I say, kulchem eini nene, right? And then ultimately, again, I don't know, kulchem asurin, and then I realize that my father's in the group. The Seifa, kegon shetila'on ze bazeh. The Seifa case of Osai is where I did what? I said, your aser, and your aser, vizeh. Rabbi say, what happens when you link everyone to each other? What happens? Their neder is interdependent, which means what? If you break part of the chain, what happens? Everyone from the break, and we'll call it, and below, ultimately again becomes permitted. So, kigon shetalan zeva amar, ploni ki ploni, uploni ki ploni. And I say ultimately again, this one should be asr like this one should be asr like this one, and I link them all together. And therefore, both say, once I go ahead and I'm matir, once I permit the neder for someone in the chain, everyone who is the derivative of that individual ultimately becomes permitted as well. Dekanami Ditani, Brisa supports this. Tisanya, Dekanami Tisanya, Hutter Ha'emsai, right? If this is the Brisa we've quoted before. Once one of the middle people, and I will say again, what that means is, if I make a neder and I say, this one is Asr, and this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, I've linked all of their Nedarim. So let's say I'm matir the second guy. Let's say I Asr 5 guys like this. I Asr Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. So what's the halacha? If I'm matir Ruvain, Rabbi say, what happens? Everyone becomes permitted. Matir Shimon, what happens? Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. Matir Levi, Yehuda. Matir Yehuda, just Yehuda. So therefore, Hutar Amtsoi, Hemenu Ulamata Mutar. If I permit the middle one, ultimately again from him and down are Mutar. Ulamala Asurin. But the ones before him, in other words, when we say Lamala means above, what it ultimately means is before him, ultimately again remain Asur. So we'll say, so once again, we're going to go through this quickly because really what the Gemara is doing is going back and forth over here to try to understand how to fit the different versions. We have two things going on over here. We have a Mishnah, and we have a Bryce of Rabbi Akiva that we just quoted over here before. So watch as well. It's a fascinating case. So, Esve Ravad bar Ava Rava. So Ravad bar Ava raised the question to Rava. Very interesting case. Konam batzal shani toim shabatzal ralalev. Listen to this case. I say onions should be usher to me like a carbon. Konam. Rabbi, remember again, konam is a kinoi for carbon. So I go ahead and I say onions should be usher to me. Why? Because onions are bad for the heart. Okay. So this is actually one of these interesting nedarim where not only do I make a neder, but what? I explicitly articulate the reason I'm making the neder. And then what happens? Amrulo, they said, oh, you're not going to believe it. Harvard Journal of Medicine just came out with a new study. V'halo ha-kufri yofel alev. The kufri onion is actually good for the heart. It's actually good for the heart. So we'll say, what's talacha? Hoter b'kufri. So we'll say, so now I'm permitted to go ahead and eat the kufri onion. Now we'll say, now what's the pshat? Now if you take a look at Rashi for just a moment, Rashi, the Mefarish, in the second wide line in Rashi, Hoter b'kufri, Rashi says, by the way, kufri is the name of a place, not really a type of an onion, Rashi points out. Right? So, hoder b'kufri, shilo another element also shura l'level of a kufri. I was about to say, why did I become permitted in the kufri onion? Why? Because I explicitly articulated, why am I taking a neder not to eat onions? Why? Because it's bad for the heart. So once I find out that there's a type of onion that's good for the heart, then Allah Maisa, of course, there's absolutely no problem with it. I was saying, here's the clincher. So the Gemara says, not only that, v'lo b'kufri bilvat hotar, Ella b'chala b'tzalim. Says the Gemara, says the Bryce, I should say. Not only am I permitting in the kufri onion, but I will say, what else am I permitted in? All onions. We'll say, now again, before we even go on, what's the logic in that? Good, Rabbi Akiva. Neder shehuter mikzaso, huter kulo. That seems to be what's driving this. Once you go ahead, once you make a neder, and you're released from some element of the neder, a neder is an all or nothing proposition. So either you're all in or you're not in at all. So the Gemara says, Maisahaya, this once happened. And in fact, again, so we'll say, it's interesting. Rabbi Meir ultimately, again, so there was once a case like this, where a guy said, I take a neder not to eat onions because onions are bad for the heart. And then they told him, by the way, the kufri onion is good for the heart. It's like, oh, okay, good to know. So what happened? So this case happened, I will say, and what occurred? And Rabbi Meir ultimately, again, allowed the person to eat all onions. Again, and Rashi points out over here, Tikasavar, neder shoter miksaso, hotar kulo. At the end of the day, because again, Rabbi Meir holds, like Rabbi Akiva, that once part of a neder is annulled, the entire neder is annulled. So both say, so now what's the case? Now what we're focused on over here is what was the actual formulation of the neder. So my lav, the amar ilu hayisi adea, shakofri yafel alev, hayisi omer kala betzal and asur mekofri mutter. Now I will say, is this essentially a case of like kulchem, where a person says, had I known, right, ila yisi I would have said, all onions are asur and kofri is mutter. So we'll say this would be a case of kulchem. And what do you see from here? That even in a case of kulchem, we still apply the principle of neder shoter miktsasa huter kulo. That even once you make an exception to kulchem, the entire neder falls apart. Lo, no, that's not the case. But Omer, ilu hayisi yodeh kufri yafel lelev. Had I known that the kufri onion was good for the heart, hayisi Omer, batzal ploni uploni asurin, the kufri mutter. Oh, they will say, what's the case? I would have said, this onion's asur, this onion's asur, this onion's asur, and kufri is mutter. So we'll say, so now Rabbi Meir libud Rabbi Akiva, libud Rabbanon. And therefore Rabbi Meir goes both according to Rabbi Akiva and according to the Rabbanon, focusing more on Rabbi Akiva, namely, neder shoter mitzaso chuter kulo. So the Rabbanon, like that, a case of lazeh. Once you go ahead and you link, right, you individualize the neder. Once you're mat your part, the entire part falls apart. And Rabbi Akiva, neder shoter mitzaso chuter kulo. Good. Eisei Ravina the Rava. So Ravina raised the kasha to Rava. Rabbi Nassan says, Yesh neder shemitzasa mutter or mitzasa asar. Okay? So we'll say, so remember again, our entire question over here. So remember, we have essentially three things at play over here, right? Let's just go through them very quickly. What are the three things at play? Right? Let's focus. How do we get here? Right? How do we get here? We have a Mishnah, right? What did the Mishnah say? I walk into my field. I see people eating my figs. I get upset. I yell out, Konam my figs unto all of you. Okay? I then discover And discover my father and my brother's there. Okay, now obviously I don't mean to include them. So what do I do? So obviously I'm going to exclude my father and my brother. Machlokes Esham Beis Hillel, ultimately again. So Beis Shammai says, fine, your father and your brother are excluded, everyone else is usher under the neder. Rabbi Beis Hillel says, no, once you exclude your father and your brother, then what? Everyone becomes permitted. So we'll say, that's the end of the Mishnah. Just to be clear, what's missing from the Mishnah? What's missing from the Mishnah? So we'll say, there has to be a process. You see, the way the Mishnah frames the case is, I walk into the field, everybody's eating my figs, I get upset, I yell at a neder, I find that my father's there, okay, so machlokes, everyone agrees my father and my brother are going to be released. Shaila is, what's the impact of the release on everyone else? What the Gemara is saying is, there's an intermediate step that's missing from the Mishnah, which is, now that I'm confronted with the reality that my father and my brother are there, what would I have said had I known from the beginning that my father and brother were there? And that's where the machlokas, Rabba and Rava, comes about. Would I have said, Kulchem asurin chutz me'aba, v'aray chutz me'aba? Would I have said, Ploni aser, Ploni aser, Ploni aser, Ploni aser, chutz me'aba? And what's the impact of those various statements? So we'll say, that's the machlokas, Rabba and Rava, how I would have framed this new type of neder, to aser everyone else, but to permit my father. Now, the underlying machlokes on that is, well, 1 second. Once you're getting into making a neder that excludes someone, is that even possible? Or do we say, neder shehuter mikzaso, huter kulo? Right? That once you permit part of it, like Rabbi Akiva says, once you permit part of a neder, the entire neder falls apart. And then the follow-up to that is, if you subscribe to that principle, is there still a way to frame an exclusionary neder? That's everything that's happening over here, with just a lot of back and forth. Let's finish up. Eisvei Ravina l'Rava. So I'll say, Ravina said to Rava, Rabbi Nassan Omer Yesh Neder Shemitzasa Motor Mitzasa Aser. There is a neder you can make where part of it remains aser, part of it remains mutter, which Rabbi say sounds like a neder shehuter mitzasa. Still could work. So we'll say, okay, so what's the case? Here we go. Neder mina kalkala. So we'll say, there's a basket of fruit. I take a neder, I'm not going to eat the fruit. Okay. Top of Chav Zayin. V'hayu ba benos shuach. And Rabbi said, Rabbi said, benos shuach is a type of fig. Superior type of fig. So in the basket, I didn't realize that. Right? In other words, I saw a fruit basket. I take a neder not to eat it. And I didn't realize that these delicious figs, these benos shuach are in there. So what happens? V'hayu ba benos shuach. V'amar, ilu hayisi adesh benos shuach besocha, lo hayisi noder. And I say, second line, 27a, and I say, you know what? Had I realized that there are benos shuach in there, I would have never made the neder. So what's the halacha? Hakalkala asura benos shuach muteres. Wow. So what's the halacha? Says the Gemara. Right? Rabbi Nassan says, the benos shuach, these types of figs are going to be mutter. The rest of the basket is going to be aser. Pretty incredible. So that's really interesting. Acheba Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva comes along. What does Rabbi Akiva say? Limeid. No. Neder shuter miksaso huter kulo. Rabbi Akiva says, no, doesn't work. In other words, it works. You didn't know there were benos shuach there. Had you known that there was benos shuach there, you would have never made the neder to aser them. Rabbi Akiva says, that's fine. We'll get you out of the neder, but once you get out of the neder for one component, Rabbi will say, then what? It becomes aser. In other words, it becomes mutter. The rest of the neder is released. So both say, again, I mentioned it before, but it bears repetition. The logic of this is very profound. Rabbi Akiva says a neder represents a commitment to a certain form of behavior. The commitment is only meaningful if what? If you're committed. Right? The moment, by definition, there are exceptions to the commitment. I must say this all the time. Right? The death knell of any life initiative are 3 words. Right? What are the 3 words? Little chazara. I will try. Right? I will try. No, you're going to try. You're going to try something again. I'm going to try to put on pants in the morning. Right? In other words, what are you talking about? In other words, if something has to get done, you have to be all in. Now, being all in doesn't mean you're necessarily going to always be successful. But one thing is clear, which is if you're hedging your bets from the outset, you are absolutely guaranteed to fail. Absolutely guaranteed to fail. So you start something new in life, I'm going to try. Okay, good luck. Probably don't even try. Do something else because you're clearly not committed. If you want something to succeed in life, you have to strike, I will try from your life lexicon. So Rabbi Akiva says, what is a neder? A neder is a commitment. A neder is a commitment. Commitments are only meaningful if you are, and it's going to be very, very profound, if you are committed, right? I was saying, it kind of undermines the commitment if you're not committed to the commitment. So Rabbi Akiva says, that's fine. In other words, it does happen where sometimes you make a neder and you realize that you didn't make the neder with full information. So now, based on the information I have, I would not have made the neder. Rabbi Akiva says, that's fine, but the whole neder is done. Neder, in other words, there's no such thing as just releasing you from part of a neder, because that undermines what a neder is. A neder is a commitment. A commitment has to be absolutely rock solid and fully committed to that commitment. The moment that there is a hole in the commitment, which is fine, it happens, the entire commitment is done. So Rabbi Akiva says, you can eat the b'no shuach, no problem, but the entire neder falls apart as well. So Gemara says, listen to this. So once again, what we're intrigued by in these cases is how are you formulating it? My love the amar ilu hayisi odeh sheb'no shuach besocha hayisi omer te'inim shchoros ulevanos asuros b'no shuach mutaros. So we'll say, maybe, what are we saying? Maybe I would have phrased the neder as like this. Had I looked in the fruit basket and realized that there are no shuach, what would I have said? I would have said like this. I would have said, the white figs are asur, the black figs are asur, but the b'no shuach are mutar. Okay. For Rabbi Akiva and therefore this reflects the view of Rabbi Akiva, o pligi Rabbanon. And the Rabbanon disagree, because Rabbi say the Rabbanon hold that in a case of ze asur, v'ze mutar, that you could pull out the mutter thing and the rest of the neder still applies. To which the Gemara says, lo. No, rather, how did I phrase it? Had I known that there were benos shuach in this basket, hayisi omer kala kal kala asura, I would have said the entire basket is asur, ubenos shuach mutaros. And benos shuach is mutar, which we'll say is the case of what? Essentially what we called before, kulchan. And you see, even in the case of kulchem, Rabbi Akiva ultimately holds neder shuter mitzvah huter kulo. So man tanalu de tanarabana. So we'll say. So who is the opinion of the following brayso? Neder mechamisha b'nei adam ke'echad. We'll say if I went ahead and I assured myself from hana from 5 people, like they were one, like a case of kulchem, huter le'echad mehem hutra kulam. Right? If I go ahead and ultimately again. Once I become mutter to one of them, ultimately again I become mutter to all of them. Listen to this. But if I say with the exception of one of them, hu mutter vehin asurin. Ultimately again, he is going to be mutter, and the rest will still remain asur. So we'll say, who is that? According to Rabba's version, we'll say, remember, everything goes back to Rabba and Rava. Rabba, Reish Rabbi Akiva, the Sefer Divrei Hakol. The Reish of that case will be Rabbi Akiva, the Sefer is everyone. Rava, but according to Rava's version, Sefer Rabbanon, the Reish of Divrei Hakol. The Sefer ultimately again will reflect the view of the Rabbanon, and the Reisha reflects the view of everyone. We'll say, okay, so what do we do with all this, right? So I will say, so again, remember, we went through this a little bit. First of all, we got to the Mishnah on Chav Zayin and Aleph. I just want to point out, right? Good, a little bit quickly, but we got there. I'll say so. Here, let's now take this back a little bit, right? So here's what we have. We have a Mishnah's case, right? Mishnah's case where this all starts. I walk into my field. People are eating my figs. I say konam. I then realize my father and my brother are there. Machlokis b'Shamai and Beis Hillel about how to deal with this case. Fine. Take that then to the Gemara. Machlokis Rabba and Rava about how to frame the machlokis. Is the machlokis ultimately again in the case of zeh, and zeh, right? Or is the machlokis in the case of kulchem? That's what's going on over here, right? Now also in all of that, do we paskin like Rabbi Akiva and Asher? I want to share with you the Shulchan Aruch. And the Shulchan Aruch you're going to see is actually going to bring all of this together so beautifully. This is the Shulchan Aruch in Siman Reish Chaf Tes Sif Aleph. Here we go, boss. Get ready. I'm going to scan this and send this out as well. Neder shehutar miksaso hutar kulo. Mic drop, right? So we pass like Rabbi Akiva. That's how this whole thing starts. That's how the Shulchan Aruch paskins. We pass Rabbi Akiva. So therefore, you make a neder. It turns out part of it was flawed. Flawed most conventionally because there's a piece of information you did not know. Now again, in this case, Rabbi will say, you're not looking to get out of the entire neder. You're just going out and looking to get out of part. Again, Mishnah's case. I walk into my field, everyone's eating my figs. I say, guys, cone on my figs on you. Then my father waves to me, right? And then I realize ultimately, again, I don't want my father in this neder. I want everyone else. I want to get my father out, keep it on everyone else. First thing Shmuel says, doesn't work. Once you're part of a neder, the entire neder becomes permitted. Watch this. I'm going to read you the Shulchan Aruch. He says, Keitzad, neder lis anos oshlo le'echal basar zman yadua. So he actually begins, this is why I wanted to go back also to Chaf Hem and base to 25b. He quotes the case of Shabbos. For example, I go and I take a neder not to eat meat or drink wine for a particular duration. And then what happens? V'iru bo Shabbos is Yom Tovim. And obviously during that duration, there's Shabbos and Yom Tov. And Shabbos and Yom Tov. So Omrim Lo, so they say to me, right, the Chacham says to me, Ilu nasata lalibecha, shira bo Shabbos Yom Tovim, lo yisanoder, v'hoter hakol. So Rabbi says, so again, so now what happens? It turns out that they tell me, how do you realize that you're not going to be able to eat meat or drink wine on Shabbos, but you have made the neder? And I say, absolutely not. So Rabbi say, what's the halacha? The neder is permitted. But it's not just permitted for Shabbos and Yom Tov. What is it permitted for? What is it permitted for? For everything. Why? Neder shehuter miktsasa huter kulo. Watch it. Shulchan Aruch goes on. V'chei im amar lechaburas anoshim. So I say to a group of people, right? Konam she'eni nene lekulchem. Right? I take a neder that none of you can get benefits from me. O shamar she'eni nene lecha ulecha have klal v'im huter echad mehem hutru kulam. So Rabbi says, so watch this. So the Shulchan Aruch does not make a distinction between kulchem and lecha, ulecha. Ultimately, again, it's a group neder. And once it turns out that I need to be released from part of that group neder, my father's in the group, I didn't know my father's in the group. Once ultimately, again, I'm released legabe my father, then what? The entire group becomes permitted. So we're going through the halacha one by one. So far, Rabbi Akiva, neder shehuter miktsasa huter kulo. And number two, really no distinction between kulchem and lecha ulecha. However, aval im amar konem sheninen lecha konem sheninen lecha. So we'll say the Shulchan Aruch does bring down. There is one example to this. If let's say you talk to a group of people and you make individualized nedarim to each person, right? Konam lecha. Even though now I'm saying it to a group, because everyone gets their own neder, if I'm released to one, then what? The others remain, which seems to be a pretty intuitive. I guess like the chap over here is you would have thought maybe since the individualized neder is being made in the context of a group, therefore halacha l'maisa, maybe they're all together. Kamash malon no, right? Vim hoter echad lo hoter kulam. See quotes over here the Rambam. Okay, fine. Let's skip a little bit. Halacha gimel. Nadar me echad va'amar al achar yehei kiploni. Kulam asurim afila ad me'ah. We'll say now there's another halacha. What's the other halacha? If I say to a group, right? Reuven, you're usher to me. Shimon, you should be like Reuven. Right? Levi, you should be like Shimon or like Reuven. It doesn't make a difference, right? What am I doing over here? I'm making a group neder. What I'm doing is I'm linking one to the other. So therefore I will say, what's the halacha? Afilu ad me'ah. Hutra harishon, hutra kulam. Hutra acharon kulam. So we'll say, so this is a little bit different. When you go ahead and you link successive nedarim one to the other, right? Reuven, you're usher. Shimon, you should be like him. Maybe you should be like him. Maybe you should be like him. So in that case, Rabbi said the nedarim are interlinked. When you're matir someone, when you're matir one of the people in the link, what happens? Everyone will call it below him in the link becomes mutter, but before him in the link remains usher. So therefore, Rabbi say, Salocha l'maisa, we now have our entire sugya. We pass like Rabbi Akiva, neder shehuter mitzasa huter kulo. Once you release from part of the neder, ultimately the neder in its entirety is released. And therefore, Rabbi say, what else? What about in terms of kulchem and lezeh? No distinction. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that halacha l'maisa, whether you phrase it as a kulchem neder or whether you're ultimately phrasing it as, to you and to you and to you and to you. Either way, once someone is released from that group, the neder in its entirety ultimately becomes mutter. Rabbi say, incredible. We're going to stop over here today for the daf. We're going to do a few minutes. We still have a few minutes. Let's do a few minutes of Mesilas Yesharim to keep on track. Rabbi say, shkoyach. Wow. Okay, good. That was solid. That was solid. Good. Let's say let's do a little Mesilas Yesharim.